Few television programs in the history of British broadcasting have managed to do what Fawlty Towers did in just 12 episodes. It did not simply entertain. It carved itself into the cultural DNA of a nation, became a reference point for generations of comedians, and produced moments so sharply observed and brilliantly executed that they are still being discussed, debated, and dissected nearly half a century after they first aired. But among those 12 episodes, one stand apart. One episode did something the others did not quite manage to do. It did not just make people laugh. It made people furious. It made broadcasters nervous. It got pulled from streaming platforms. It sparked a debate that has never really ended. And it did all of this while being, by almost any serious critical measure, one of the finest pieces of televised comedy ever produced. That episode was called The Germans. And the story of what it did, why it did it, and what happened because of it is one of the most fascinating chapters in the entire history of British television. To understand why The Germans landed the way it did, you have to understand what Fawlty Towers was, where it came from, and what it was trying to do. The show was a creation of John Cleese, who by the mid-1970s was already well established as one of Britain's most daring and intelligent comic voices through his work with Monty Python. But Fawlty Towers was a different project entirely. It was smaller, more contained, more focused. Rather than the sprawling, surrealist sketch format of Python, this was a tightly wound domestic farce built around a single location, a second-rate hotel in Torquay, and a single, magnificently terrible human being at its center. Basil Fawlty, played by Cleese with an intensity that sometimes bordered on alarming, was not a lovable rogue. He was not a well-meaning fool. He was a snob, a bully, a man consumed by social anxiety and misplaced pride, who treated his guests with barely concealed contempt and his staff with something considerably worse. He was, in short, a disaster, and that was precisely the point. Fawlty Towers was built on the fundamental comic principle that people like Basil, arrogant, self-important, and catastrophically lacking in self-awareness, always, inevitably, get exactly what they deserve. Cleese co-wrote the series with Connie Booth, his then-wife, who also played Polly, the sensible and long-suffering hotel maid. Together they crafted scripts of almost architectural precision, where every joke was load-bearing, every misunderstanding was carefully planted, and every disaster unfolded with the terrible, inevitable logic of a Greek tragedy played entirely for laughs. The BBC aired the first series in 1975 to a somewhat muted initial response, but something about the show refused to go away. Repeat broadcasts drew larger and more devoted audiences. Word spread, and by the time the second series aired in 1979, Fawlty Towers had transformed from a modest critical success into something approaching a national institution. The second series contained 6 episodes, and the final episode of that run was The Germans. It is worth pausing to consider the episode construction before discussing the controversy it provoked, because understanding how skillfully the episode is built is essential to understanding what the controversy actually reveals about the people who were offended by it. The episode opens with a subplot involving a moose head, a stuffed animal trophy that Basil has inexplicably decided to hang in the hotel lobby, and quickly establishes that Basil has been suffering from the aftermath of concussion. He is, in other words, even less in control of himself than usual, even less capable of the social filtering that prevents most people from saying the things they are thinking. His wife Sybil is in hospital for a minor foot operation, which removes the one figure who might conceivably keep Basil from completely unraveling. Into this already volatile situation arrives a group of German tourists, perfectly pleasant guests with no particular interest in causing trouble. Basil, aware of his own tendency to make catastrophically inappropriate remarks, issues what becomes one of the most quoted instructions in British television history. Don't mention the war. He says it to his staff. He says it to himself. He says it with the urgent sincerity of a man who genuinely believes he can hold himself together if he just keeps repeating the instruction. He cannot hold himself together. What follows is a masterclass in escalating comic catastrophe. Every attempt Basil makes to avoid the subject of the war leads him directly, helplessly, inevitably back to it. He flinches at harmless words. He reads sinister meanings into innocent questions. He becomes so consumed by the effort not to mention the war that he can think of nothing else. And then, in a sequence that has been replayed and referenced thousands of times since, he loses what remains of his composure entirely and launches into a performance, a full goose-stepping, Hitler-imitating, arm-waving spectacle right there in the hotel lobby that is so far beyond acceptable behavior that it functions as its own punchline. The German guests, through all of this, remain largely calm and bewildered. They are not the butt of the joke. They never were. The butt of the joke is Basil, who cannot mention the war precisely because he is so preoccupied with it, so defined by a particular kind of small-minded British chauvinism that he cannot encounter a group of German people without his entire personality collapsing into a frenzied pantomime of outdated prejudice. The satire is not aimed at Germany. It is aimed at Britain, at a specific strain of British attitude that was recognizable to millions of viewers in 1979 and has not entirely disappeared since. But not everyone saw it that way. The episode aired to enormous viewing figures and generated an immediate and deeply divided response. Many viewers, the majority, it should be said, found it hilarious for exactly the reasons Cleese and Booth intended. They recognized the satire. They understood that Basil was the joke. They laughed at his humiliation and his exposure, and went to bed feeling that they had watched something genuinely clever. Others, however, were less certain. Letters arrived at the BBC. Some were from viewers who felt the episode had strayed into genuinely offensive territory, that whatever the satirical intention, the sight of a major television comedian performing a Hitler impression during prime time was not something that could simply be excused by pointing at the character's stupidity. The war was not ancient history in 1979. There were still millions of people alive across Europe, on all sides, who had lived through it, who had lost people in it, who carried its weight in ways that a comedy program about a bad hotel could not fully account for. BBC executives found themselves in an uncomfortable position. The episode had been made. It had been broadcast. It had drawn huge audiences. But the complaints were real and the discomfort was genuine, and there were serious internal discussions about whether the episode should be repeated in the same form or perhaps quietly shelved. In the end, it was not banned. It continued to be broadcast and included in compilations and retrospectives, but the debate about it never entirely went away. The response in Germany itself was, perhaps predictably, more complicated than either British camp anticipated. Some German viewers who encountered the episode, either through import or later through wider international distribution, understood immediately what it was doing. They recognized Basil's behavior as a satire of British attitudes rather than an attack on German people, and they found it genuinely amusing. There is something particularly sharp about watching a character destroy himself trying not to be offensive, and that dynamic translated across the cultural divide more effectively than the BBC's nervous executives might have expected. But others did not find it funny, and their reasons deserve to be taken seriously, not dismissed as oversensitivity. For people whose families had been directly affected by the war, who had grown up in its shadow, who had spent their lives grappling with questions of guilt and memory and national identity in ways that the British, as victors, had largely been spared, watching a prime-time comedy program deploy Nazi imagery as a punchline, however satirically framed, was not a straightforwardly amusing experience. The satirical intent does not erase the visceral impact. Both things can be true at once. This tension between the artistic integrity of the satire and the genuine pain it could cause is what made the Germans genuinely interesting as a cultural object, rather than merely a great piece of television comedy. It was not simply offensive. It was not simply brilliant. It was both, simultaneously, and the discomfort that combination produced was, in a way, exactly what good satire is supposed to generate. John Cleese, for his part, has never backed away from defending the episode. Over the decades, he has returned to it repeatedly in interviews, explaining with characteristic directness what he and Boo were trying to achieve and why he believes the criticism, while understandable in some respects, fundamentally misreads awake. His argument is straightforward. Basil Fawlty is not a mouthpiece for the show's values. He is the show's primary target. Everything Basil does, every snobbery, every burst of cruelty, every catastrophic social misstep, is presented not for the audience to enjoy vicariously but to observe and judge. The comedy comes from watching someone like Basil be repeatedly and comprehensively defeated by his own worst impulses. In The Germans, those impulses happen to involve a particularly British cultural obsession with the Second World War, an obsession that Cleese and Booth considered worth satirizing. They were making fun of a real phenomenon, the strange way in which some British people, decades after the war's end, had developed an identity partly constructed around it, could not quite let it go, kept returning to it in ways that said more about their own anxieties than about anything that actually happened in Germany. Basil's Hitler impression is not presented as funny because Hitler is funny. It is presented as a final, spectacular self-destruction of a man who has spent the entire episode fighting his own prejudices and losing. By the time he starts goose-stepping across the lobby, he has gone so far beyond recovery that all the audience can do is stare in appalled, helpless recognition at what unchecked arrogance and self-deception ultimately produce. The war jokes weren't aimed at Germans. Cleese has said on multiple occasions. They were aimed at the British obsession with the war and at Basil's stupidity. It is a distinction that matters, and it is a distinction that the episode's critics, both in 1979 and in subsequent decades, have sometimes failed or refused to make. The controversy surrounding the Germans did not end in the 1970s. If anything, it has intensified in more recent years as streaming platforms began making older television programs available to global audiences and subjecting them to scrutiny by viewers with very different cultural contexts and very different expectations about what comedy should and should not do. Several streaming services, in the early 2020s, chose to remove the Germans from their libraries entirely, or to broadcast it with edited cuts removing specific scenes or lines. The response from fans of the original program was immediate and furious. To many of them, these edits represented not sensitivity but a fundamental misunderstanding, the satire without explaining why they were there in the first place, leaving viewers with something blander and more confusing than the original. What makes The Germans such a durable and fascinating case study is that it refuses to resolve cleanly into either the positions people tend to want to occupy in these debates. It is not straightforwardly offensive, and it is not straightforwardly above criticism. It is a piece of work that was made with genuine intelligence and genuine artistic purpose that achieved something real and difficult, making people laugh at something genuinely painful, and that also, in doing so, caused real discomfort to people with legitimate reasons for being uncomfortable. The lesson it offers is not that satire should be unlimited, or that artists should never have to think about the impact of their work. It is something more complicated than that. It is that comedy, at its most ambitious, operates in exactly the space where certainty breaks down, where what looks from one angle like cruelty looks from another angle like truth, where what feels from one position like an attack feels from another position like a mirror. Fawlty Towers held that mirror up to a particular version of British society and refused to look away from what it reflected. The Germans did that more boldly, more uncomfortably, and more memorably than almost any other episode of any other British sitcom. And the fact that it is still being argued about, still being edited and defended and banned and reinstated, is not evidence that it failed. It is evidence that it succeeded more completely than even its creators might have anticipated. The show's legacy, built in just 12 episodes across 2 short series, is almost impossibly large for something so brief. And The Germans, the episode that caused more trouble than any other, the one that nearly got pulled, the one that streaming platforms removed and fans offended with fierce loyalty, sits at the center of that legacy. Basil Fawlty, in all his grotesque, infuriating, brilliantly observed glory, was never a hero. He was a warning. He was what happens when pride goes unchecked, when self-awareness is absent, when a person constructs their entire identity around anxieties they refuse to examine. And in The Germans, that warning was delivered with more force and more precision than anywhere else in the series. The infamous scene, the goose step, the Hitler impression, the complete and total collapse of a man into his own worst instincts, did not take Fawlty Towers off the air permanently, but it did something arguably more significant. It made the show impossible to forget. It ensured that decades later, people who had never seen a single episode would still know the phrase "don't mention the war" and understand, at least roughly, what it meant. That is what great satire does. It makes itself unforgettable by saying the thing that is true and uncomfortable and funny all at once. Fawlty Towers did that better than almost anything else British television has ever produced. And The Germans did it better than almost anything else Fawlty Towers ever made.